The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and charred wood, a strange mix that made Jacob's chest tighten. He stood at the edge of his cabin, staring into the dark forest, where shadows danced like restless spirits under the pale moonlight. The distant crackle of fire echoed through the trees, growing louder by the second. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just any wildfire. It felt alive, hungry, almost deliberate. Jacob wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. His mind raced back to the first time he'd stepped foot in these woods years ago, a lost man searching for peace after losing everything. That day, he never expected to find more than solitude. But life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. As the flames crept closer, licking at the edges of the clearing, Jacob heard a low growl behind him. It sent shivers down his spine, but oddly enough there was no fear, only relief. Turning slowly, he saw two golden eyes glowing softly in the darkness. They weren't menacing, they were familiar. "Boreas," Jacob whispered, his voice trembling not from fear, but gratitude. The massive bear emerged from the shadows, its fur singed in places, its movements slow yet purposeful. Boreas had been part of Jacob's life since the day he found him as a scrawny cub abandoned by a stream. Now, standing tall and powerful, the animal seemed to understand the gravity of what was happening. But how did Boreas know? How did he always seem to sense danger before anyone else? Jacob shook his head, pushing those questions aside for now. There was no time to think about mysteries tonight. All that mattered was survival. And somehow, deep inside, Jacob knew this night would change everything again. The fire roared louder, snapping branches like twigs as it devoured the forest. Jacob glanced toward the cabin one last time, knowing there was nothing left worth saving except the memories, and the bond he shared with the creature beside him. With a heavy sigh, he turned to Boreas. "Let's go," he murmured, placing a hand on the bear's broad shoulder. Together they stepped into the chaos, leaving behind the only home Jacob had known for years. Little did Jacob realize, this escape wouldn't just save their lives. It would uncover secrets buried deeper than either of them could imagine. Secrets tied to the very reason Boreas had come into his life all those years ago. The forest around them was alive with the sounds of destruction. Crackling flames, snapping trees, and the distant cries of animals fleeing for their lives. Jacob and Boreas moved quickly, their steps synchronized as if they had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. The heat was unbearable now, pressing against Jacob's skin like an invisible weight. His lungs burned with every breath, but he didn't dare slow down. Not when Boreas was leading the way. As they pushed deeper into the woods, away from the cabin, something strange began to happen. The fire seemed to follow them, not just spreading naturally, but almost chasing them. It zigzagged unnaturally, consuming patches of land that should have been too wet to burn. Jacob glanced over his shoulder, his stomach sinking as he realized the flames were closing in faster than before. "Boreas," Jacob called out, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "We need to find water, now." The bear stopped abruptly, sniffing the air. For a moment, Jacob thought Boreas might be confused, disoriented by the chaos. But then the animal let out a low growl and turned sharply to the left, heading toward a narrow path barely visible through the haze. Jacob hesitated only for a second before following, trusting the instincts of the creature who had never steered him wrong. They burst into a small clearing moments later, where a shallow stream cut through the underbrush. The water shimmered faintly under the moonlight, offering a glimmer of hope. Jacob dropped to his knees, cupping handfuls of the cold liquid and splashing it onto his face. Beside him, Boreas lowered his massive head to drink deeply, his golden eyes scanning the surroundings warily. But just as Jacob started to feel a sliver of relief, a loud snap echoed through the clearing. Both man and beast froze, their heads whipping toward the sound. From the shadows emerged a figure, a woman, her clothes tattered and smeared with soot, her hair wild and tangled. She held a lantern in one hand, its flickering light casting eerie shadows across her face. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling but firm. Her eyes darted between Jacob and Boreas, lingering on the bear for a beat longer than seemed natural. "This isn't safe." Jacob stood slowly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "We're trying to escape the fire," he explained, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Who are you? What's going on?" The woman hesitated, clutching the lantern tighter. Then, without warning, she stepped closer, her gaze locking onto Boreas. "He led you here, didn't he?" she asked, her tone sharp with accusation. "That bear, he knows things. Things no animal should know." Jacob frowned, confusion mixing with unease. "What are you talking about?" "Boreas has saved my life more times than I can count. If it weren't for him, I'd still be back there." The woman shook her head, her expression darkening. "You don't understand. This fire, it's not natural, and neither is your bear." She took another step forward, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Do you remember the day you found him? Do you remember what else you saw?" Jacob's mind raced back to that fateful afternoon years ago. He had stumbled upon the tiny cub whimpering by the stream, half-starved and alone. But there had been something else. A strange symbol carved into a nearby tree, glowing faintly before fading away. At the time, he'd dismissed it as exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. Now, standing in the midst of this nightmare, doubt crept in. "What do you know about that symbol?" Jacob demanded, his voice rising. "And why does it matter now?" The woman opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the ground beneath them trembled violently. A deafening roar split the air, louder than anything Jacob had ever heard. Boreas immediately positioned himself between Jacob and the source of the noise, his body tense and ready to fight. From the edge of the clearing, something emerged, a shape shifting and writhing like smoke given form. Its eyes glowed red, piercing through the darkness like twin embers. Whatever it wasn't human or animal, and it was coming straight for them. "Run!" the woman screamed, grabbing Jacob's arm. "It's after him!" Jacob didn't need to ask who she meant. Boreas let out a ferocious roar, charging toward the monstrous figure. But as Jacob turned to flee, he couldn't shake the feeling that the answers he sought were tied to the very creature risking everything to protect him. The twists were far from over, and neither Jacob nor Boreas would ever see the next revelation coming. Jacob's legs burned as he ran, the woman's hand gripping his arm like a vice. Behind them, the monstrous figure let out another bone-chilling roar, and the ground shook with each of its thunderous steps. Boreas was still there, somewhere in the chaos, holding the creature at bay. But for how long? Jacob could hear the bear's defiant growls mingling with the unnatural shrieks of their pursuer, a sound that sent shivers crawling up his spine. "Where are we going?" Jacob shouted over the din, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest around them blurred into streaks of shadow and firelight, disorienting him further. "There's a place, somewhere safe," the woman replied, her voice strained but determined. She didn't look back, didn't falter, even as embers rained down around them like fiery snowflakes. "But we have to hurry. It won't stop until it has what it came for." "What it came for," Jacob echoed, his mind racing. He stumbled over a root, nearly falling, but the woman yanked him upright without missing a beat. "What does that mean? What is it after?" The woman hesitated, glancing at him briefly before focusing ahead again. Her lips parted as if she wanted to explain, but instead she muttered, "You'll see soon enough." They broke through a wall of dense foliage into another clearing, smaller than the last, dominated by an ancient oak tree whose gnarled branches twisted toward the sky like desperate hands. At the base of the tree was a hollowed-out opening, dark and foreboding, leading underground. The woman released Jacob's arm and gestured urgently toward the entrance. "In there," she commanded. "Quickly!" Jacob hesitated, staring at the gaping maw of the earth. Something about it felt wrong, unnatural, just like everything else tonight. But the deafening crash of splintering trees behind them left no room for debate. Whatever was chasing them was closing in fast. Without another word, Jacob ducked inside, the woman close behind him. The air grew cooler almost immediately, carrying with it the faint scent of damp stone and something metallic. The passageway sloped downward, twisting sharply after only a few steps. Darkness swallowed them whole, broken only by the dim glow of the woman's lantern. For a moment, all Jacob could hear was the sound of their labored breathing and the soft crunch of gravel beneath their feet. Then, from above, came a guttural roar so loud it seemed to shake the very walls of the tunnel. Jacob froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. Is it following us?" he whispered, afraid to raise his voice. The woman nodded grimly, her face pale in the flickering light. "It will. But this place, it's protected, for now at least." "Protected?" Jacob wanted to ask more, demand answers, but the urgency in her tone silenced him. They pressed onward, deeper into the labyrinthine passage. The farther they went, the heavier the air became, pressing down on Jacob like a suffocating blanket. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to find Boreas, but he couldn't leave the woman alone. Not when she clearly knew more than she was saying. Finally, they reached a cavernous chamber illuminated by faint bioluminescent moss clinging to the ceiling. In the center of the room stood a pedestal carved from black stone, etched with intricate symbols that pulsed faintly with an otherworldly light. Jacob's stomach churned as he recognized one of the markings. It matched the symbol he'd seen years ago near the stream where he'd found Boreas. "What is this?" Jacob asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darted between the pedestal and the woman, who had stopped several paces away, her expression unreadable. "This," she said softly, stepping closer to the pedestal, "is why you're here, why he's here." She pointed upward, presumably toward Boreas, or perhaps the thing hunting them. "And why that thing won't stop until it gets what it wants." Jacob frowned, shaking his head. "I don't understand. What does any of this have to do with me or Boreas?" The woman sighed, her shoulders slumping as if burdened by some great weight. "That bear isn't just a bear, Jacob. He's different, special, and you've been connected to him since the day you found him. You're part of something bigger than either of you realize." Before Jacob could respond, the ground trembled violently once more. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the chamber. The woman's eyes widened in panic. "It's here," she breathed. From the shadows at the edge of the room emerged the monstrous figure again, its form shifting and writhing like smoke given life. But this time it wasn't alone. Trailing behind it, limping but alive, was Boreas. Blood matted his fur, and his golden eyes were filled with pain, but also determination. With a final, defiant roar, the bear lunged at the creature, driving it back toward the entrance. "No!" Jacob shouted, rushing forward instinctively, but the woman grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "You can't help him," she cried. "Not yet. If you want to save him and yourself, You need to listen to me. This isn't just about survival anymore, it's about destiny." Jacob stared at her, his chest heaving, torn between the urge to fight alongside Boreas and the nagging suspicion that she was right, that there was more to this story than met the eye. But then, from the pedestal, a faint hum began to resonate, growing louder with each passing second. The symbols etched into the stone flared to life, bathing the room in an eerie blue glow. And as Jacob watched, transfixed, the woman reached out and touched the surface of the pedestal. A surge of energy rippled through the chamber, knocking Jacob off his feet. When he looked up, the world around him had changed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The blue light from the pedestal engulfed the chamber, pulsating like a living thing. Jacob shielded his eyes, the intensity of the glow searing into his vision even through his closed lids. The air crackled with energy, and for a moment it felt as though time itself had frozen. The monstrous figure at the entrance let out a deafening screech, recoiling from the sudden surge of power, its smoky form writhing in agony. Boreas, still standing between the creature and Jacob, roared defiantly but seemed to falter under the weight of the unnatural force filling the room. "What's happening?" Jacob shouted, scrambling to his feet. His voice echoed strangely, distorted by the hum that now filled the cavern. It wasn't just sound. It was a vibration that resonated deep within his chest, as if the very essence of the earth was speaking directly to him. The woman didn't answer immediately. She stood beside the pedestal, her hands hovering over its glowing surface, her face illuminated by an ethereal light. Her expression was one of awe and fear, as though she were witnessing something both beautiful and terrifying. "This is why you were chosen," she finally said, her voice trembling. This is the Nexus." "The what?" Jacob demanded, his frustration boiling over. He took a step toward her, but the ground beneath his feet shifted unnaturally, forcing him to stumble back. The moss on the ceiling pulsed brighter, casting eerie shadows across the walls. "What are you talking about? Chosen for what?" Before she could respond, the pedestal emitted a sharp, piercing tone, and the symbols carved into its surface began to rearrange themselves, swirling like liquid metal. A single word formed in the center of the stone, glowing brighter than the rest. "Guardian." Jacob stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. Guardian. The word stirred something deep inside him, a memory or perhaps a feeling he couldn't quite place. It was as if he'd heard it before, whispered in dreams or carried on the wind during quiet moments in the forest. But how could that be? "You don't remember, do you?" the woman asked softly, her gaze fixed on Jacob. There was sadness in her voice, but also resolve. "That day you found Boreas. It wasn't chance. You were drawn to him, to this place, and he was drawn to you." Jacob shook his head, backing away instinctively. No, I'm nobody. Just a guy who got lost in the woods and stumbled onto a cub. That's all this is." But even as he spoke, doubt crept in. Memories flooded his mind, fragments of dreams he'd dismissed as meaningless. Dreams of golden eyes watching over him, of forests alive with whispers, of a bond deeper than friendship or loyalty. And then there was the symbol he'd seen near the stream, the same one now etched into the pedestal. It had haunted him for years, lingering at the edges of his thoughts like a half-forgotten promise. The woman stepped closer, her lantern extinguished by the overwhelming light. "You're wrong, Jacob. This isn't coincidence. You're part of something ancient, a connection older than either of us can comprehend. That bear, he's not just an animal, he's a guardian too, bound to protect you, and you're bound to protect him." Her words hit Jacob like a punch to the gut. He wanted to deny them, to laugh them off as nonsense, but the truth was undeniable. Everything, the fire, the strange woman, the monstrous figure, even the glowing pedestal, pointed to a reality far beyond anything he'd ever imagined. And then, just as the thought settled in his mind, the pedestal flared once more, releasing a wave of energy that sent both Jacob and the woman sprawling. When Jacob looked up again, the chamber had changed. The walls shimmered like glass, reflecting scenes that weren't there before. Vast forests, towering mountains, endless skies. Each image flickered briefly before fading, replaced by another. Among them, Jacob caught glimpses of himself, not as he was now, but as someone else entirely. Someone stronger, braver, surrounded by creatures that defied explanation. What is this?" Jacob stammered, reaching out instinctively toward the visions. His fingers brushed against the shimmering wall, and a jolt of electricity shot through his arm. Pain exploded in his chest, followed by a sensation unlike anything he'd ever experienced. A rush of warmth, of clarity, of purpose. The woman watched silently, tears streaming down her face. "It's beginning," she whispered, "the awakening." Suddenly, the monstrous figure let out a final, ear-splitting roar and lunged forward, breaking free of the light's hold. Boreas intercepted it, slamming into the creature with enough force to shake the entire cavern. The two collided in a blur of claws, smoke, and fury, their battle tearing apart the fragile balance of the chamber. "We have to stop them," Jacob shouted, his instincts screaming at him to act. But the woman grabbed his arm again, pulling him back. "No, you can't interfere, not yet. If you step in now, everything will collapse. Trust me, Jacob. This fight isn't just theirs, it's yours too." Jacob's heart pounded as he watched Boreas struggle against the creature, blood staining the ground beneath them. For the first time, he realized the truth. Whatever bond he shared with the bear went beyond mere companionship. It was a link forged in something ancient, something sacred, and now it was being tested in ways he never could have anticipated. As the battle raged on, the pedestal began to crack, fissures spreading across its surface like veins. The symbols glowed brighter, almost frantic, as if warning of something catastrophic about to happen. The woman turned to Jacob, her eyes wide with urgency. "You need to make a choice," she said, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "Stay here and risk losing everything, or take the next step. Become what you were always meant to be." Jacob hesitated, torn between fear and destiny. Then, without another word, he reached out and touched the pedestal. The world shattered around him. The moment Jacob's hand made contact with the pedestal, the chamber imploded in a kaleidoscope of light and sound. The cracks running across its surface widened, releasing torrents of energy that spiraled upward like liquid lightning. The air was sucked out of the room in an instant, leaving Jacob gasping for breath as he felt himself being pulled, not just physically, but spiritually, into something vast and incomprehensible. Images flooded his mind at a breakneck pace. Ancient forests untouched by time, civilizations built by creatures that were neither human nor animal, battles fought under skies painted with fire. He saw himself standing among them, clad in armor forged from starlight, wielding a weapon that pulsed with the same blue glow as the pedestal. Beside him stood Boreas, not as a bear, but as a towering figure of golden light, his eyes burning with divine purpose. And then, just as quickly as they came, the visions vanished, replaced by darkness so absolute it felt suffocating. Jacob floated in nothingness, weightless and disoriented, until a voice broke through the void. A deep, resonant tone that seemed to echo from every direction at once. "Jacob," it called, calm yet commanding, "you have been chosen." He tried to speak, to ask who or what was speaking, But no words came. Instead, the darkness began to shift, coalescing into shapes and forms. A figure emerged, humanoid but impossibly tall, its body composed entirely of shifting shadows and glowing runes. Its face was obscured, save for two piercing white eyes that bore into Jacob's soul. "You are the Guardian," the figure continued, its voice reverberating through Jacob's very bones. "Bound to protect the balance between worlds, bound to protect him." Jacob's heart raced as understanding dawned. This wasn't just about him or Boreas, it was about something far greater. The forest, the fire, the monstrous figure, all of it was part of a larger conflict, one that had spanned centuries and would continue long after he was gone. But why him? Why now? Before he could process further, the shadowy figure raised a hand, and a surge of memories, not his own, flooded his consciousness. He saw glimpses of other guardians before him, each paired with their own protector, their own counterpart. Some succeeded, others fell, their failures plunging entire realms into chaos. And always there was the looming threat of the creatures like the one attacking Boreas, beings born of imbalance, seeking to unravel the threads that held existence together. "This is your legacy," the figure said, lowering its hand. "But know this, the path ahead will demand sacrifices, choices you may not be prepared to make." As if on cue, the scene shifted again. Jacob found himself back in the cavern, though it was unrecognizable now. The walls shimmered with the same otherworldly light as before, but the battle between Boreas and the creature had escalated to unimaginable levels. The ground cracked and splintered beneath their fury, and the pedestal, the Nexus, was on the verge of collapse, its symbols flickering erratically. The woman stood nearby, her face pale and streaked with tears. She clutched something in her hands, a small, jagged shard of black stone, pulsing faintly with red light. When she noticed Jacob staring, she held it up, her expression grim. "If you want to save him, if you want to save both of them, you'll need this," she said, her voice trembling. "It's a fragment of the Void Stone. It can banish that thing, but using it comes at a cost." "What kind of cost?" Jacob asked, dread pooling in his stomach. Her gaze dropped, and for a moment she looked older than he'd thought possible. "A life for a life," she whispered. "To destroy the creature, someone has to take its place. Someone has to become the prison." Jacob froze, the weight of her words crashing over him like a tidal wave. His eyes darted to Boreas, who was visibly weakening, his golden fur matted with blood and ash. The creature loomed over him, its form shifting and writhing, its red eyes gleaming with malice. There was no way the bear could hold out much longer. "No," Jacob murmured, shaking his head. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," the woman snapped, her voice breaking. "This is how it works. This is how it's always worked. You wanted answers, Jacob. Now you have them. The question is, are you willing to pay the price?" Jacob's mind raced, torn between desperation and resolve. He couldn't lose Boreas, not after everything they'd been through. Not after realizing the depth of their connection. But could he really sacrifice himself? Could he leave behind the only family he'd ever known? Before he could decide, the pedestal let out a final, ear-splitting hum, and the entire chamber began to collapse. Chunks of stone rained down from the ceiling, and the glowing moss dimmed, plunging the room into near darkness. The creature roared triumphantly, sensing victory within reach. "Jacob!" the woman screamed, thrusting the voidstone shard into his hands. "You don't have time to hesitate. Make your choice." Jacob stared at the shard, its red light pulsing in sync with his heartbeat. Every fiber of his being screamed against what he knew he had to do. But as he looked at Boreas one last time, at the bear who had saved him countless times, who had become more than just a companion, he realized the truth. Some bonds went deeper than life itself. With a deep breath, Jacob tightened his grip on the shard and stepped forward. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Then, without another moment's hesitation, he plunged the shard into his own chest. The moment the void stone shard pierced Jacob's chest, a searing pain exploded through his body, radiating outward like wildfire. He staggered backward, clutching at the wound as the red light from the shard spread across his skin, pulsing violently with each heartbeat. The air around him crackled with energy, and the cavern seemed to shudder in response, the walls groaning under the strain of an unseen force. "No!" the woman screamed, rushing toward him, but she was too late. The transformation had already begun. Jacob fell to his knees, gasping for breath as the shard's power coursed through him. His vision blurred, and the world around him shifted, colors inverted, sounds distorted, reality itself bending and warping like water rippling under a stone. For a fleeting second he saw himself reflected in the shimmering walls of the chamber, not as Jacob, the man who had wandered into the forest years ago, but as something else entirely, something ancient, something powerful. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pain subsided. Jacob looked down at his hands, which now glowed faintly with the same blue light that had emanated from the pedestal. The shard was gone, absorbed into his very being, leaving behind only a faint scar over his heart. But he could feel its presence, a weight, a responsibility, a tether binding him to something far greater than himself. "What? What have I done?" Jacob whispered, his voice trembling. He felt different, stronger, yet somehow lighter, as though a part of him had been stripped away and replaced by something foreign yet familiar. "You've sacrificed yourself," the woman said softly, her voice filled with both awe and sorrow. She knelt beside him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. But not completely. Not yet. Before Jacob could respond, the monstrous figure let out a deafening roar, its form convulsing wildly as if caught in some invisible trap. The creature thrashed against an unseen force, its smoky essence unraveling thread by thread, until finally, with one last ear-splitting shriek, it collapsed inward, consumed by the void stone's power. In its place stood a swirling vortex of darkness, pulsing faintly with red light, the prison Jacob had created. For a moment, silence reigned. The cavern stabilized, the trembling ground settling back into stillness. Boreas limped forward, his golden eyes wide with confusion and relief, as he nudged Jacob gently with his massive head. Jacob reached up instinctively, placing a hand on the bear's fur, but his touch felt different now, charged, almost electric. "It's over," Jacob murmured, more to himself than anyone else. But even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at him. Was it really over, or had he merely delayed the inevitable? The woman stood slowly, brushing dirt from her tattered clothes. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a heaviness in her gaze that made Jacob uneasy. "Don't look so relieved," she said finally, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "You think banishing that thing solves everything? You've only scratched the surface." Jacob frowned, his grip tightening on Boreas's fur. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, glancing toward the glowing vortex before meeting his eyes again. That creature, it wasn't acting alone. It was a scout, a harbinger. There are others like it, stronger ones waiting beyond the veil. And now that you've tapped into the Nexus— She trailed off, shaking her head. "You've marked yourself, Jacob. Marked us all." A chill ran down Jacob's spine. Marked? What does that mean? It means they'll come for you, she replied grimly. For both of you. She gestured toward Boreas, whose ears twitched at the mention of his name. The Nexus chose you because it sensed your potential, but it also made you a target. Every step you take from here will draw them closer. Jacob swallowed hard, his mind racing. He'd thought sacrificing himself would be the end of it, the ultimate act of protection. Instead, it seemed he'd opened a door he couldn't close. But why me? Jacob asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why did this happen to me? The woman sighed, her shoulders slumping as if burdened by centuries of regret. Because you're not just Jacob anymore. You're the guardian now. And guardians don't get to choose their fates, they inherit them. Her words hung heavy in the air, sinking into Jacob like lead. Before he could process further, the pedestal, the Nexus, let out a low hum, drawing their attention. Its symbols, once glowing brightly, were fading, dimming until they vanished altogether. The chamber grew darker, the bioluminescent moss losing its luster. Whatever connection Jacob had forged with the Nexus, it was changing, evolving. And then, without warning, the pedestal cracked cleanly down the center, splitting apart with a sound like thunder. From the fissure emerged a single object, a small, intricately carved key suspended midair as if held by invisible hands. It hovered for a moment before drifting toward Jacob, stopping just inches from his face. "What is that?" Jacob asked, his voice tinged with apprehension. The woman stared at the key, her expression unreadable. "It's your next step," she said quietly. "Your trial." "My trial?" Jacob echoed, his stomach sinking. "I just fought off a monster and absorbed a cursed shard. What more do you want from me?" "It's not about what I want," she snapped, her patience wearing thin. "It's about what the Nexus demands. That key opens a gateway to somewhere you need to go, somewhere dangerous." Jacob glanced at Boreas, who let out a low growl, his golden eyes fixed on the key. Whatever lay ahead, the bear was ready to face it alongside him. But Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that this journey would test them in ways neither of them could imagine. As if sensing his hesitation, the woman stepped closer, her voice softening. "Listen to me, Jacob. You've taken the first step. Now you need to finish what you started. Take the key, find the answers, protect the balance. That's your purpose now." Jacob hesitated, staring at the key as it floated silently before him. Finally, with a deep breath, he reached out and grasped it. The moment his fingers closed around it, the cavern began to collapse once more, the walls crumbling inward as the Nexus sealed itself shut. "We need to move," the woman shouted, grabbing Jacob's arm and pulling him toward the exit. Boreas followed closely, his massive frame navigating the narrow tunnels with surprising agility. They burst out into the night air just as the entrance to the cavern caved in behind them, sealing whatever secrets remained buried within. The forest was eerily quiet now, the fire extinguished by the Nexus power. Above them, the stars shone brighter than ever, casting an ethereal glow over the landscape. Jacob clutched the key tightly, his mind racing with questions. Where did it lead? What awaited them on the other side? And most importantly, what price would they have to pay next? As if reading his thoughts, the woman placed a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever happens, remember this. The choices you make will shape not just your fate, but the fate of everything." With that cryptic warning, she turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Jacob and Boreas alone beneath the starlit sky. The key pulsed faintly in Jacob's hand, urging him forward. Whatever came next, he knew one thing for certain. Their journey was far from over. The forest was eerily still as Jacob and Boreas stood beneath the starlit sky, the weight of the key in Jacob's hand growing heavier with each passing second. It wasn't just a physical object. It felt alive, pulsing faintly with warmth that seemed to sync with his heartbeat. Every instinct told him to run, to put as much distance between himself and the collapsed cavern as possible. But another part of him, a deeper, primal urge, urged him to stay, to follow wherever the key wanted to lead. "All right," Jacob muttered under his breath, more to himself than to Boreas. "Let's see what you're hiding." He turned the key over in his hands, examining its intricate carvings. The symbols etched into its surface were unfamiliar, yet strangely familiar at the same time, as if they belonged to a language he'd forgotten but could almost understand. One side bore the faint outline of a tree, its roots twisting into the shape of an eye. The other side depicted a crescent moon cradling a single star. Both designs glowed faintly, casting soft shadows across Jacob's face. Before he could decipher their meaning, the key let out a low hum, vibrating violently in his palm. Startled, Jacob nearly dropped it, but before he could react further, the ground beneath his feet began to tremble. A circle of light erupted around him, spreading outward in concentric rings until it illuminated the entire clearing. At the center of the circle, the air shimmered like heat waves rising from asphalt, distorting the world beyond. "What the—" Jacob started, but the words caught in his throat as the shimmering air solidified into a doorway. Beyond it lay not the forest, but a vast expanse of rolling hills bathed in twilight. The horizon stretched endlessly, dotted with strange structures that looked like ruins, but not of any civilization Jacob recognized. They were angular and jagged, made of black stone that seemed to absorb the light around them. Above, 2 suns hung low in the sky, one golden and one blood-red, casting conflicting hues across the landscape. Boreas growled softly, his hackles raised as he sniffed the air. Whatever lay beyond the portal, it unsettled even him. "This isn't Earth," Jacob whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind that had begun to pick up. He glanced at Boreas, who met his gaze with unspoken determination. "You ready for this?" The bear let out a low rumble, stepping closer to Jacob's side. Together, they took a hesitant step toward the threshold. But just as Jacob was about to cross, a voice rang out behind him, sharp, commanding, and unmistakably angry. "Stop right there!" Jacob spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure clad in dark robes, their face obscured by a hood. In one hand, they held a staff carved from bone-white wood, its tip glowing faintly with the same blue light that now emanated from Jacob's chest. Their presence was suffocating, radiating an aura of authority and danger. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, their voice cold and devoid of emotion. "That key doesn't belong to you." Jacob instinctively stepped back, positioning himself between the stranger and Boreas. "Who are you?" he demanded, clutching the key tightly. "What do you want?" The figure tilted their head slightly, studying him with an intensity that made Jacob's skin crawl. "I am a keeper," they replied simply, as though the title explained everything. "And you've meddled with forces far beyond your comprehension." Jacob frowned, his grip tightening on the key. "Meddled? I didn't ask for any of this. Some monster attacked us, and I did what I had to do to protect my friend. If you're trying to stop me, you're too late." The keeper's posture stiffened, and for a moment Jacob thought they might attack. Instead, they lowered their staff slightly, their tone shifting to something almost weary. "You misunderstand," the keeper said, their voice softer now, though no less menacing. "I'm not here to stop you. I'm here to warn you." "Warn me about what?" Jacob asked, his frustration boiling over. "Everyone keeps talking in riddles. Just tell me what's going on." The keeper hesitated, glancing briefly at the portal before returning their gaze to Jacob. "That key opens a gateway to the Veil, a place between worlds, a place where the balance is maintained. But crossing it comes at a cost. Every step you take will unravel more of the truth, and every truth will demand a sacrifice." Jacob's stomach churned. Sacrifices again. Wasn't giving up part of himself through the Voidstone shard enough? "I don't care about sacrifices," Jacob snapped, his voice rising. "All I care about is protecting Boreas and stopping whatever's coming for us. So, unless you're going to help, get out of my way." For a long moment, the keeper said nothing, their hidden eyes boring into Jacob as if weighing his resolve. Then, with a sigh, they raised their staff once more, pointing it directly at the portal. "Very well," they said, their tone resigned. "But know this, the path ahead is not yours alone. Others walk it too, some allies, some enemies, and one of them—" They paused, their voice dropping to a whisper. "Is already closer than you think." Before Jacob could ask what they meant, the keeper stepped forward, raising their free hand. With a flick of their wrist, the portal flared brightly, expanding until it filled the entire clearing. The wind howled louder, pulling at Jacob and Boreas as if trying to drag them inside. "Go," the keeper commanded, their voice cutting through the chaos. "But remember, trust no one, not even yourself." Jacob hesitated, torn between fear and determination. Finally, with a deep breath, he tightened his grip on the key and stepped through the portal, Boreas close behind. The sensation was unlike anything Jacob had ever experienced. It felt as though he were being pulled apart, atom by atom. His consciousness stretched thin across infinite space. Colors swirled around him, blending and shifting in ways that defied logic. Time itself seemed to warp, moments stretching into eternity before snapping back into focus. When the disorienting journey finally ended, Jacob stumbled onto solid ground, gasping for air. Boreas landed beside him with a heavy thud, shaking his massive head as if trying to clear it. They weren't alone. Standing a few yards away, silhouetted against the twin suns, was a figure Jacob recognized instantly. His blood ran cold. It was the woman, the one who had led them to the Nexus. But she looked different now, her tattered clothes replaced by sleek armor, her lantern gone, replaced by a blade strapped to her hip. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes burned with purpose. "I told you we'd meet again," she said, her voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. "But I never said whose side I was on." Before Jacob could respond, the ground beneath them quaked violently, and from the horizon a shadow loomed. A monstrous silhouette far larger than anything they'd faced before. As it drew closer, Jacob realized with growing dread that this wasn't just another creature. It was the true enemy, and it had been waiting for them all along. A shadow on the horizon moved with unnatural speed, its massive form blotting out the twin suns as it approached. Jacob's breath hitched in his throat as details began to emerge. The creature was a patchwork of darkness and light, its body composed of shifting fragments that seemed to flicker between existence and non-existence. Its eyes, if they could be called that, glowed with a malevolent red hue, piercing through the twilight like twin beacons of doom. "Stay behind me," Jacob whispered to Boreas, though he knew the bear wouldn't listen. Sure enough, Boreas positioned himself shoulder to shoulder with Jacob, his golden fur bristling as he let out a low, guttural growl. The woman, no, warrior, stepped forward, unsheathing her blade with a metallic ring that echoed across the barren hills. Her armor gleamed faintly under the dim light of the blood-red sun, but there was no mistaking the tension in her stance. She wasn't here to guide them anymore. She was preparing for battle. "What is that thing?" Jacob demanded, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to stay calm. He clutched the key tightly in one hand, its warmth offering little comfort against the icy dread creeping up his spine. "That," the woman replied without looking back, "is what happens when the balance breaks completely. It's not just a creature, it's a manifestation of chaos itself, and it's been hunting guardians for centuries." Jacob's mind raced. Chaos, balance. None of this made sense. All he knew was that whatever was coming for them now was far beyond anything he'd faced before. And judging by the grim set of the woman's jaw, even she wasn't sure they could survive this. As the monstrous figure drew closer, the ground beneath their feet cracked and splintered, fissures spreading outward like veins. The air grew heavier, pressing down on Jacob with an almost physical weight. He felt the key pulsing in his hand, its vibrations growing more erratic, as if reacting to the approaching threat. "We need to move," the woman shouted, breaking into a sprint toward a cluster of jagged ruins in the distance. "If we can reach those structures, we might have a chance." "A chance at what?" Jacob yelled back, following her lead with Boreas close behind. "Fighting that thing? We barely survived the last one? And you think running will save us?" She shot back over her shoulder, her voice sharp with urgency. "That thing doesn't stop until it consumes everything. If we don't fight, we're already dead." Jacob clenched his teeth, forcing himself to focus. She was right. They couldn't outrun this. Not here. Not in this strange, alien landscape where every step felt like walking through quicksand. But fighting it? That seemed impossible too. When they reached the ruins, Jacob realized why the woman had chosen this spot. The black stone structures formed a natural barrier, their angular shapes creating narrow pathways and makeshift shelters. More importantly, the air around them shimmered faintly, as if imbued with some kind of protective energy. "This place is fortified," the woman explained quickly, taking cover behind a crumbling wall. "It won't hold forever, but it'll buy us time." "Time for what?" Jacob asked, crouching beside her. Boreas stood guard nearby, his golden eyes fixed on the advancing monstrosity. "For you to figure out how to use that key," she said, nodding toward the object in his hand. "It's not just a gateway opener, it's a weapon, a conduit for the Nexus power, but you need to unlock it first." Jacob stared at the key, his heart pounding. Unlock it? How? He didn't even know where to start. Before he could ask, the creature roared, a sound so deafening it felt like the world itself was tearing apart. The ground shook violently, sending chunks of rubble tumbling down from the ruins. The woman cursed under her breath and raised her blade, her expression grim. "It's here," she said simply. The creature emerged from the dust cloud, its towering form casting a long, distorted shadow over the battlefield. Up close, it was even more horrifying than Jacob had imagined. Its body shifted constantly, parts of it dissolving into smoke only to reform moments later. Its claws scraped against the ground, leaving deep gouges in the black stone, and its mouth, if it could be called that, was a gaping void filled with swirling darkness. Boreas lunged forward without hesitation, charging straight at the beast with a ferocity that took Jacob's breath away. The bear collided with the creature, his massive frame slamming into it with enough force to stagger even something so large. But the monster barely reacted, swatting Boreas aside like a fly. The bear hit the ground hard, skidding several feet before struggling to rise again. "No," Jacob screamed, rushing toward Boreas despite the danger. He dropped to his knees beside the injured animal, his hands trembling as he checked for wounds. Boreas groaned softly, his golden eyes meeting Jacob's with a mixture of pain and determination. "You idiot," Jacob muttered, tears stinging his eyes. "Why do you always have to protect me?" But before he could say more, the woman grabbed his arm and yanked him to his feet. "There's no time for this. You need to focus." "I can't," Jacob shouted, wrenching free of her grip. "I don't know how to use this stupid key. I'm not some hero. I'm just a guy who got dragged into this mess." The woman hesitated, her expression softening slightly. For a moment, she looked almost sympathetic. Then, with a resigned sigh, she reached into a pouch at her side and pulled out a small vial filled with glowing liquid. "Drink this," she ordered, shoving the vial into his hands. "It'll amplify the Nexus connection to you. Maybe then you'll understand." Jacob stared at the vial, unsure whether to trust her. But what choice did he have? With a shaky breath, he uncorked it and drank the contents in one gulp. The liquid burned as it slid down his throat, igniting a fire in his chest that spread throughout his body. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he might pass out. Then, suddenly, clarity washed over him. Memories, not his own, flooded his mind. He saw glimpses of past guardians wielding the Nexus power, channeling it through keys like the one in his hand. He saw battles fought across countless worlds, victories won and sacrifices made, and most importantly, he saw how to use the key. The realization hit him like a lightning bolt. Without hesitation, Jacob raised the key above his head, pointing it directly at the creature. The symbols etched into its surface flared to life, bathing the battlefield in blinding blue light. The creature let out a deafening screech, recoiling as if burned. For the first time, it hesitated, its movements faltering as the light enveloped it. "Now!" the woman shouted, raising her blade. "Strike while it's vulnerable." Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Jacob focused on the key, channeling the Nexus power through it. The ground beneath his feet trembled as energy surged outward, forming a beam of pure light that struck the creature head-on. The beast writhed in agony, its form dissolving into smoke. But unlike before, it didn't reform. Instead, it began to collapse inward, consumed by the very chaos it embodied. As the creature vanished, the landscape around them shifted once more. The ruins crumbled into dust, replaced by a serene meadow bathed in golden sunlight. The twin suns were gone, replaced by a single familiar star, Earth's sun. Jacob collapsed to his knees, exhausted but alive. Beside him, Boreas lay panting, his injuries healing rapidly as if touched by magic. The woman stood a few paces away, watching silently as the meadow stretched endlessly in all directions. "It's over," Jacob murmured, clutching the key tightly. "We did it." But the woman shook her head, her expression unreadable. "No," she said softly. "This is only the beginning." And as Jacob turned to ask what she meant, he realized she was gone, vanished without a trace. The key pulsed faintly in his hand, its glow dimmer now but still present. Whatever trials lay ahead, Jacob knew one thing for certain. The Nexus had chosen him for a reason, and he would face whatever came next, not just for himself but for Boreas, for the balance and for the fragile thread that held their world together. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the greatest challenges were yet to come. Jacob sat in the middle of the serene meadow, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him like an invisible tide. The golden sunlight warmed his skin, but it couldn't touch the chill in his heart. Boreas lay beside him, his massive head resting gently on Jacob's lap as he panted softly, still recovering from the battle. Jacob ran his fingers through the bear's thick fur. each stroke a silent promise, a vow to never take this bond for granted again. For so long, Jacob had thought of himself as alone in the world. After losing everything, his family, his home, he'd wandered into the forest seeking solitude, only to find something far greater. Purpose. And now, sitting here with Boreas, he realized how much that purpose meant. It wasn't just about survival or protecting the balance. It was about connection, about love. Tears welled up in Jacob's eyes as memories flooded back. The day he'd found Boreas as a scrawny cub, trembling and abandoned by the stream. The countless nights they'd spent together under the stars, sharing quiet moments that needed no words. The battles they'd fought side by side, not just against monsters but against despair itself.